Today we're going to be going over changing directions with our procedural generation. This is the second video in a mini-series all about procedural generation, so if you missed the first one, I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Before we get started, I'm going to clean up our chip here so that we can have a little bit more organization. To start with, I'm going to get out a microchip, and we can call this stopwatch. I'll set the icon to look like a timer so we know what it is. And I'm going to move the number displayer, the manipulator, and the timer in here. Along with this, I'm also going to add an input node, and this will be for the counter being full, and that will go into the freeze. That way we can delete this wire, and I can call this node stop. I'll set it to a flag, and now we can close that. Now our timer stopwatch is out of the way. I'm also going to change this to be in the top middle here just so it's a little nicer to look at. The next thing I'm going to do is get out another chip, and we'll call this generate transform. This chip will do exactly what it's labeled, meaning it will generate a transform. Inside I'm going to place an in node and an outgoing node. I'll name the incoming node tick. This is going to be powered by this on-end trigger. I'll name the outgoing node transform, and that's what we'll use to send the transform out of this chip. I'll take the combiner, which creates the transform, as well as our operational calculator there, and I'll bring those in. I'm going to delete this wire and instead pass that to the transform output. I'm going to delete this calculator because we'll be dealing with things a little bit differently from here on out. I'm going to move the counter down as well as this NOT gate, this AND gate, and I'm going to delete this wire here. So we still have the same conditions going on here. When the trigger ends and the counter is not full, then we can turn on the emitter. Instead of using a keyframe, I'm just going to use a wire connecting them. We don't have to worry about this firing for more than a frame because this is based off of a pulse. Not this one, but this is a pulse. Our transform will come up here, and we will take the transform and plug that into the scene space transform. One last thing I'm going to do is take the object just emitted wire and plug that into the counter increase. And now we have a much cleaner looking chip that we can use. Now we can begin to talk about how we're going to change directions. If I bring out this tag again from before and I look at this, let's say we're generating a path and we want the path to change directions, not just be in a straight line. If this is the top of our cube, then we will want to move this in X and Z directions. If we wanted to also have it be 3D in our path, meaning it go up and down as well, we could also add Y directions. For now, we're only going to focus on the X and Z, and we'll get into the Y direction in the future. I'm going to open the generate transform chip and turn off the grid so we can see better. Now we're going to be dealing with the X and Z values, so we need a way to manipulate those. I'm going to get out a calculator, and I saw this trick in a Neon Coder video where he took the output of a calculator and plugged it into the B input. And what this essentially does is create a sort of local variable, as he liked to call it, which will store a number here. So what happens is if we get, say, a pulse of 1 coming in here, it will add 1 to 0, which will output 1, and then it will store that in B. And as long as it's a pulse, then B will be 1 and A will be back at 0, and we can store that number. I'm going to get out a signal manipulator and pulse it. And I'll get this switch out and I'll plug that into here like so. Now you can take a look at the calculator. If I turn the switch off and then turn it back on, 1 was added to B, and then B is now being stored. We can continue to add, and it will continue to store the number in B, as long as this is a pulse. The reason we have the signal manipulator is to keep it at a pulse. If I were to not use a pulse and just have it constant, what would happen is when we start time, every time I turn this on, it ramps up really quickly because it's constantly adding 1 every frame. So this way, when we use a pulse, we can increase by 1 every time. Now we already have a pulse coming from tick, which will add every time this fires, which is every time the timeline is done. If we open this up, it starts at 0, and every 2 frames it's now adding 1. If I were to increase the timeline, say to a second, then every second we will be adding another 1. So in this sense, this is, if I plug this into the X, this is essentially what we were doing before. If I start time, we can see it spawns them out. Again, I've gotten rid of the calculator that was multiplying by half, so they're spaced out, but it is doing exactly what we were doing before. Notice it's also very slightly slower. The only reason it is slightly slower is because we're using this object just emitted output to increase the counter, which fires at a different time than this on-end trigger. If I send a signal from the on-end trigger into the counter, this will be increased while this logic is happening, and I don't want that to happen. I want it to happen after we've completed this. Now, since we're going in multiple directions, let's take a quick second to talk about how this should work. I'll grab a little paintbrush here so we can make a little visualization for ourselves. If we have something moving in this direction, after one step, we can do one of two things. We can continue moving forward, or we can change directions. We could go right, or we could go left. And for the sake of creating a path, going back doesn't really make that much sense. I don't want a path that goes up and then right, but then back to the left and then back down, especially in a 2D sense, because this doesn't really create anything of interest. If anything, this would cause issues with understanding what you're supposed to do or what the path is. Where does it lead to? Where does it begin? If a path is a circle, there's nothing really to do within that circle other than continue to go around and around. Since that's the case, we have two options. We can continue in the direction we're going, or we can turn right or left. No matter which direction we're going, if we're going to the right, we can either continue to go to the right, or we can change directions to either the right or the left, based off the current direction. With that out of the way, now we can think about it in X and Z coordinates. Since there are 4 basic directions, I'm going to get out a selector and set this to 4 ports. We will consider these north, east, south, and west. It doesn't really matter which way is true north and east. However, as long as we're staying true to the same system, things will work out. I'm going to consider A north, which is in this direction, which is a negative Z direction. From there, we can use these move to next output and previous output to change our directions. So if this is north, then next would be east, and D would be west. That way it can, from north, it can only go to east, or it can go back down here to west. So with that, we have north, east, south, and west. North is negative z, east is positive x, south is positive z, and west is negative x. I've gotten out 4 value sliders here, and I'm going to use these in conjunction with our selector to increase or decrease the x and z values. As we said before, north is going to be -1 in the z direction, so I'll use this to power this value slider. East is +1 in the x direction, so I'll use b to power this. South will be a positive in the z direction, and west will be a -1 or negative in the x direction. I'm going to do the same thing I did before with this little trick, and I'm going to use 2 of these. One will be for the x position. The other one will be for the z value. And I'm going to plug the north into the z value, the east into the x value, the south into the z value, and the west into the x value. When these value sliders are off, they pass in a 0. When they're on, they pass in whatever the value is. So we see we have this value slider and this value slider are both off, so they're both being passed into here, and they're producing a 0. Here I have a 1, which is off, so a 0, and a -1 being passed into here, and you can see that a -1 is being passed in. There's an issue here in that this is continually ramping up, and that's because we're not using a signal manipulator. This is easily fixed by adding a signal manipulator, and we'll use the remap and change these to go from -1 to 1. That way, when it's -1, we'll still get a signal coming out. And I'll do exactly what I did before, and we'll plug these into the calculators. I'll clone this down, plug these in, and put that in there. Now I don't need to worry about pulsing these because we're going to use this pulse to power the selector. So you can see it's off by default. Both of these calculators are zeroed out. I'll actually leave these open so we can see what happens when we start time. We'll start time, it pulses, and every time this pulses, this is being, -1 is being added. If I set our timeline to only play once, we can see how that looks. It pulses once and that's it. X, or x is at -1 and z is at 0. We can now take these calculators and plug them into the position that's being put into the transform. So now what we have is something that has the capability of changing directions whenever the selector changes. Currently it's just sitting on A. I've just realized that I've put these in the wrong cables here. I'm going to put these where they belong. These should go into the Z position, and these should go into the X position. So right now, we're only going north, and if I start time, we can see we go north. In order to fix this spacing issue, there are a couple ways we could do it. We could use another calculator like we did before. If we were going to use the same size block forever, we could also remap these to be at 0.5 in the positive direction and -0.5 in the negative output direction. And what this will do is when we get a 1, it'll output 0.5. If we get a 0, it'll output 0. And if we get a -1, we'll output 0.5. So if we had both of these like this, and started time, we could see that they would be touching. This will cause issues in the future if we decide to use varying size blocks to emit, or shapes, or whatever it is, but for now we'll leave it this way, and I'll get into how we can fix that in the future. So now that we're moving north, we need to be able to change directions. How often our generation changes directions depends on how we want our result to be. But if we want to start off simple, we could use a randomizer. If we make the randomizer have 3 ports and set it to true random, we could consider one outcome of this randomizer to be no change in direction. The second one would be a change in direction, and the third one would be change in the other direction. So if I start time now, without anything being plugged into this, this will randomly pick a port and stick with it. So that went with port A. If I go again, it'll go with port B. If I go again, it goes with port B. So it's random in which way it's going. But let's say we want to change direction not just in the line, not just for not once, but every block. How could we do that? Well, we have a tick coming in here, so we could randomize every time we generate. And that'll give us some sort of random squiggly shape. So we can see if we increase the counter, let's say we go to 100 now, and start time, we can see that it's randomly changing directions. We're going to need to change the tail unless this is a desired result. Say you had a runner game where somebody had to follow the path for as long as they could. The tail could work like this so that they can't take their time, and as long as your tick is at a reasonable rate, they could try and follow this for a certain amount of time, and when they fall off, that could be a score right there, you know? So that's how you could use that for, you know, a simple game. However, if we want to keep it, we can set this to max emitted at once to infinite, and that will generate as many as our counter will allow for. Now let's say we didn't like the randomizer choosing whether or not we continue or which direction we go in. As it stands right now, every tick provides a 1 1/3 chance of any of these 3 things happening, which makes it fairly random, which may be the look you're going for, but say you wanted a little bit more control. Instead of using this randomizer to determine whether we continue or change directions, we can just use the randomizer to choose the direction that we want to go in when we decide to change directions. So instead of firing this every tick, we can then use a signal generator, and we'll set the min and max for each of the value ranges to 0 and 1. With a signal generator like this, at 1 second sweep, every time it hits one of these numbers, it changes the graph completely and provides a brand new random number to go towards. If we set the sweep seconds down to 0.1 seconds, this will provide us one new random number between 0 and 1 every 3 frames. And if we set it to 0 seconds, I believe this is producing a random number between 0 and 1 every frame. We can't get this to produce a new number every 2 frames, but it doesn't matter, because this selector is only on every 2 frames. So if we use a calculator, we can use a probability or a percentage to determine how often we decide to change directions. So say we want a 50% chance of continuing forward every block, or a 50% chance of changing directions. So what will happen is every 2 frames, every time this fires and the selector is on, there's a 50-50 chance of continuing in the same direction that the selector is currently on, or changing directions to either the one next to it or the one before it. So now if I start time, with the 50% chance, you can see that it's much smoother in terms of longer passages. And if we change this to be something much higher, like 9.9, what this is doing is it must be higher than 0.9 to change directions, meaning we have a 10% chance every block to change directions. This is going to produce much longer straight lines with much less turning. And however you want that to work is completely up to the result you desire. So this about sums it up for changing directions, at least in a very simple manner. In the future, I'll go over how we can avoid having crossovers like this if that's something that is undesirable. There's a way we can fix that, and that'll be in a future video. In the next video, we'll be talking about a technique for changing the orientation of each cube. Say each cube face has a different decoration, or a power-up, or a boost pad, or something like that, and you want these to randomly have different things on them. We'll be going over that next time. So if you're interested, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.